Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. We have an interesting video series that we're putting together for you so that you can learn how to navigate your state oil and gas commission website to learn more about your minerals and royalties and specifically what the oil and gas potential of those interests are. And I know this is probably the first question that comes into mind when you find that you own minerals and royalties if you've inherited them. It's the first thing that somebody looks for when they are looking to invest in a piece of property.
You nailed it, Matt. And the ability to look up these documents is really a skill set that a mineral owner should have to be able to properly manage their minerals. And though it's easy to tell people to go look at these websites, actually knowing how to navigate them can get really complicated fast if you've never been there and don't know what to do.
That's right. And that's why we wanted to go through step by step and show you how to do this in this video. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, we have a video that accompanies this episode on my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Matt Sands Mineral Rights, and you'll find it there. And there'll be a series you'll see for how-to videos. And for those of you that are watching this, be sure to like and subscribe to this video and check out the links below for other episodes that you can find if you own minerals and royalties in other states as well. So we're going to go through the major oil and gas producing states and show you how to navigate the basic things that you should be able to do owning mineral rights and royalties. And we're not going to talk about legal descriptions and how to read them and all of that. This video assumes you have a basic know-how in that area. If you don't, I have a online course called Mineral Management Basics that is a great place to start to build the foundation around the types of oil and gas interests, how to read a legal description, and how to navigate all the major oil and gas commission websites, as well as how to perform a title search, and then ultimately determine what the oil and gas potential of your interests are so that you can make the most of that particular asset. And if you're a mineral investor trying to learn about this asset class, that course is an excellent way to learn about the basic due diligence steps that you would need to perform in researching different mineral properties. And that brings us to this example that we're going to talk about, Justin, which I found on EnergyNet. Many of the listeners have heard of EnergyNet before. It's an online auction marketplace where people can buy and sell minerals and royalties. And I just used it to find a random property in Colorado, which we're going to focus on that state in this episode. Just so that you can see in practice, how do you navigate the website? How do you search for a particular legal description? How do you find the documents that you need to see for those wells, if there are wells in that section, or in general, what type of permitting activity or what type of spacing or pooling orders have been issued for that particular area. So Justin, you and I have talked a lot about the Texas Railroad Commission, and that's obviously one that you're super familiar with your interests primarily in Texas. What has your experience been and the type of documents you can find on these state oil and gas commission websites?
I mean, it's a really useful resource for, drilling permit, completion notices, the well plats to really take a look at, where are they producing minerals from. I mean, it can really be important to answer questions like, do I have an interest in a new well? Do I own an overriding royalty? And is that overriding royalty still active? And then other questions that can come up. It's about the only place you can really go for that information.
Absolutely. It's the one-stop shop. It's really the only place you can find that. It's the one version of the truth for your state is that state oil and gas commission website. Now, the names of those websites or those commissions are different from state to state. Texas, it's the Railroad Commission. In Colorado, it used to be the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, or COGCC, but they rebranded in 2023 to the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission to take into account the carbon capture and sequestration side and sort of modernizing it, but they still look after health and safety aspects of the oil and gas industry, as well as the pooling and spacing and permitting of wells and all that stuff. So it's kind of the regulatory body within Colorado that regulates the oil and gas industry. And like Justin mentioned, the things that we want to be able to look at is if we have wells, we want to be able to go and download a copy of the well permit because that'll tell you what formation the well is producing from, the area, in other words, the spacing unit or the size of the area that's being pulled together and the oil is being pulled from, and then things like timing for when those wells were drilled or completed, or if they're planning to be drilled and completed. You can find out a lot of information, especially in Colorado. I really like the Colorado ECMC website. It's very user friendly, very informative, and we'll show you how to navigate that here in a second. But what I really want to focus on are the things that you really want to have a copy of as a mineral royalty owner or as a beginning investor. You need to have copies of any of those drilling permits for your wells. Like Justin said, those well plats are really critical in understanding the area being pooled together and whether or not or how much your minerals are included in that. And so you can determine your net interest in that well and your decimal interest to determine how much you should be getting paid. And as far as those important documents, again, I go through my course how to organize those, but those are the things you should just keep for the life of those wells, so that if there's ever a question about your decimal interest, or if you have to pass these interests down to an heir, you have all the background information in one place for them to learn about the wells that are there, where they're producing from, what's your interest in those wells, when it was drilled, and any sort of major events that have occurred in the life cycle of that well. And the other way you can find out a lot of information about your oil and gas interest is by contacting the operator. So that's a really good way to determine what are their plans, especially if there's wells that are permitted, or how they came up with your decimal interest in that well, if you have a question about that. So I know, Justin, that's always the first place that you go to as well if there's a question about plans or about what has happened.
You said it, man. It's the Bible. It's the one source of truth, and it's a great place to go to do the research and figure out where to go from there. And like we mentioned, Matt, where it really comes down to is each one of these websites can be very unique in their interface and how a user actually goes about looking for the information. And so we're going to show that. And Matt, this may change over the years, but it's been interesting to see how much some have changed, like Colorado, and then how much others have not changed.
Yeah, Colorado is obviously on the forefront of a lot of regulatory changes. And so that kind of goes into the naming of the ECMC. That is sort of a progressive type of a name, for lack of a better term, around how they are managing energy. Now, as far as getting our hands dirty and going in and figuring this all out, I want to say there's a couple of triggering events. Justin, you mentioned you may have found out that you have new permits near you within like a 2 mile radius. If you have a Mineral IQ account, you'll get a notification when there's things like new permits, or if a rig is nearby drilling. And that's a good time to go and actually visit your state oil and gas commission website and determine if you would have an interest in those wells. And so that's an important question. The other common question is if you've inherited minerals and royalties recently and you just want to learn, are there wells nearby? What's the value of this asset, relatively speaking? And what's the likelihood of me starting to receive royalties? Is there drilling going on nearby? And to your earlier question, I think the most important thing, if you own an overriding royalty interest and if you're not getting paid, a good question, is that just because there's a title issue and you're not in pay status, or is that because the override actually doesn't exist anymore because that oil and gas lease terminated when the last well stopped producing? So that's something with an overriding royalty interest, which again, we go over in a lot more detail in my course. But basically, that has to have an active oil and gas lease because that's tied to the oil and gas lease and not the minerals. And so if you have an overriding royalty interest you inherited, you would need to go in there and do some research to figure out the timing of when a well was drilled, if that lease that your predecessor had an interest in, was there continuous production basically from the time when that lease was signed until today, and to where that override would be active still, or did production cease and they plugged and abandoned the last well, and then at that point the lease would have terminated. So you'd have to go into the Oil and Gas Commission website and do some research to figure that out.
You nailed it, man. And really, the research that you're going to do on the Oil and Gas Commission only answers half of that question. And as you've mentioned, you've really got to know the title work that's there. And you've got to know at this point that you've at least have a potential ownership in a certain legal description, Matt. And I think that's important to mention. And like you said, taking that course will really help you to understand that. And this is kind of the next step on doing the research.
That's right. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's go ahead and pull up the legal description of the property in question here. And again, if you're listening to this episode on the podcast and want to check out the video, you can go to a YouTube channel and check that out and watch along. So what we're going to look at is, first of all, let's say that we are interested in a particular property on EnergyNet, or let's say that we've inherited this property or we just own this property and we know the legal description. And where you would find the legal description, again, is on your mineral deed. And in this case, we're looking for a mineral tract in Township 2 North, Range 64 West of the 6th Principal Meridian, Section 4, Southwest Quarter. And this particular deed, this is a EnergyNet interest. Again, I just pulled this randomly just so we could use it for an example. But if you were looking at buying this property on EnergyNet, for example, you'd want to go and do due diligence first. Or if you owned this property, then you would have a deed that you would have gotten from your predecessor, relative, whatever, and it would have a description of the property that you received. Now, this legal description is really the key to everything because that determines where this property is located on the surface of the earth. And from there, we can then determine what wells are nearby or what wells are going through this mineral tract. Now, the thing to note here as well, basically the key things I'm looking for to be able to hone in on this is Township 2 North, Range 64 West, Section 4. So first, what I'm going to do is open up the ECMC website. So again, this is the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission website, and we'll put in the link in the description below and then in the show notes. So there's a couple different things you'll find on the ECMC website. Now, there are regulatory filings and regulatory information, things like hearings and rulemakings and the orders around pooling and spacing. And so one place to go is if there is a pooling order or spacing order, you can go and search by the legal description to determine if there is anything. In this case, this is Section 4, 2 North, 64 West. You can hit submit and it'll tell you all of the oil and gas orders that have been issued for that particular section. And I usually want to look at the last one because that tells me the kind of the latest iteration. What's the spacing? What are the lands that are being pulled together? And here I can see in January of 2023, that's earlier this year, a pooling order was issued, which pulled together all of Section 4, which is our section that we're interested in, all of Section 9, and then the north half of Section 16. Altogether, that's 1,440 acres. And if you wanted to look at the full order itself, you could download a copy of the order here. But the other way that you can actually hone in on where this is located on the map is from here and clicking on the GIS section. And that'll actually pull up the COGCC/ECMC map interface. And it will take you directly to those sections. So as you can see here in the center of the screen, section 4, 9, and 16. And when I open up the COGCC map interface, I like to turn on a couple of different things. I turn on the well status, which will show the status of that well bore. And I'll talk about what that means here in a second. We'd want to see where there are horizontal wells. And so that's where you click on this directional well bores, and then it will pull up the horizontal wellbore location. And if there are permits, you want to turn that on. And that's these blue and green. That would show you if there were any permits that have been issued recently or pending permits, which are the blue. So that would be the initial indicator. And maybe if you're getting a bunch of purchase offers in the mail or phone calls about your minerals, it's probably because there are permits or maybe there's even a well being drilled. To be able to move the map around, you have to click on this little hand icon, and that'll allow you to scroll around and kind of move the map up and down. If you like to look at different background images, you can look at aerial photo behind it to see, is this an urban area? Is it a rural area? Which becomes important in Colorado because of the regulations and the setback requirements from buildings that, like churches or homes or things like that. A couple different things on the symbols here. You can expand this well status layer and it'll show you all of the symbols and what they mean. Interesting symbol to keep an eye on is this blue star. That tells me that they're drilling a well. And this next section over, this is Noble Energy, which is now Chevron. is drilling these wells here. In our case, it looks like they have already drilled in section 4. We have what looks to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 well bores that go through our section. And because of that pooling order that we saw before, we know that all the minerals in section 4, section 9, and then the north half of section 16 are pooled together. In other words, every mineral owner within those legal descriptions that I just mentioned will receive their proportional share of the production from these 7 wells, depending on your net interest in those mineral tracts. So that is a great sign. If we had just inherited these interests and maybe our predecessor hadn't been receiving any royalties, it might be that they haven't actually started paying royalties yet, and you would be expected to get some checks coming in here soon. In order to figure out more about these wells, I want to zoom in and actually make sure I'm clicking on the well that goes through that northern part. Looks like this is the Gig'em State Y9 drilling and spacing unit, and it looks like it's been producing since July of 2023. So actually, being this December of 2023 when we're recording this, if we had just inherited these, our predecessor probably hadn't received their first royalty check yet. And so as you're going through probate and getting these transferred over to your name, you need to reach out to the operator and let them know that you're the new owner, and then to provide a copy of those probate documents, and then ultimately that personal representative's deeds that vests interest into you. Or if you were looking to buy this interest, you'd want to look at when the effective date of the transaction is. Is it back to the date of first production, or is it December? So you'd have to forecast production from December forward. You wouldn't get paid royalties on the oil and gas that's already been produced. But this is what you could look for. You'd say, okay, how much oil is this well producing per month? How much gas is it producing? And all of this information you can find on that ECMC website. When you click on a well name here, it'll pull up the production data. And again, that tells me month by month how much oil was produced, how much was sold, how much gas was produced, how much gas was sold. And when you go to audit your royalty check, that's the type of information you'll need to have at your fingertips. We should see the production this for the month of September for oil that they sold 24,524. If it's a different number, that's something that's a discrepancy. We'd need to understand why that's different. For oil, that's pretty straightforward to do. Gas becomes a little more complicated because you're paid on the dry gas, like the actual production or pipeline quality natural gas, and then also the natural gas liquids. You can get a rough approximation of the value of both of those with the BTU factor. In this case, the ECMC website has the gas BTU, which is 1,347. So what I would do if I were estimating the value with the gas, I would look for what the price of gas was for the month of September, multiply it by the 47,697 MCF that you see here for the gas that was sold, multiply by 1.347 for the BTU factor, and then that would give you the value, the gross value, and then you have to multiply that by your decimal interest in that well to figure out how much of that you should have received. So that's a quick and easy way to figure out the approximate value of both the natural gas and then the natural gas liquids. Of course, it's going to be a little bit higher for the natural gas liquids. It's not so much just a straight factor on the gas price itself, but at least that gives you a floor or a minimum that you should have gotten paid. You should be more than that. So good information, just even from looking at the production data. There's the information I have at my fingertips to be able to audit a royalty statement. So I really like the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, or ECMC website, has that information at your fingertips, very easily accessible. You can download it to Excel spreadsheet so that you can go in and put some formulas in and calculate those. We have a podcast episode that we did on how to do a quick and easy end of year royalty audit, as well as more of an in-depth royalty audit. And we'll link to those episodes in the show notes as well as in the video description below. So make sure you check those out if you haven't already. Any comments, Justin, on what's your first impression?
I think this is pretty easy to navigate compared to what some of them have to offer. Like you said, it makes it really easy with all the linking to the different information, and curious to see how drilling permits and that kind of thing are displayed.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So let's take a look at that next. So this facility detail, or this well scout card, will have everything in that central location for that well. And I want to mention one thing as well. After we're done with showing you navigating it from looking at the pooling order, I'll show you how to search this a couple of other different ways. So to your point, Justin, we want to look at the well permit for this. And the way we would go and find that is the image documents for this well. So there's a doc link at the top. We'll click on that and it'll have a list of all the documents associated with that well. And what we're looking for a drilling permit is an APD. That's an application for permit to drill. And that's a very common term within the industry. A lot of other states use that term. And I want to look at the approved well permit. It'll tell me exactly what type of information I need to know about that well, including the surface hole location in section 16, like we saw on the map, bottom hole locations in section 4. Again, we saw that in the map as well. This facility was approved actually back in 2017. That facility already existed. I think there may be the well pad. They're drilling from the same well pad as the unit to the south, so that is useful. And then again, it'll help if we look and find the well permit. If we're finding this information another way, like we'll show here in a second, and you wanted to know what the spacing order was, they have that on the well permit as well. In this case, it's that same information. We saw 1,440 acres, the spacing order. So we could go back to that screen I showed at the beginning to search for the spacing order to pull a copy of that, and a list of all of the tracks that are included within that spacing unit. And so that if you had a tract that was fully within that, like we mentioned, we're looking at the southwest quarter of section 4, which all of that is within this unit. Could be that you have an interest, let's say if you had an interest in the north half of section 16, and only the north half of the north half is part of this unit, and then it looks like the south half of the north half would be part of that other unit. So you would actually have an interest in multiple units and multiple wells. So that's why it's so important to know your legal description and then know the unit location and exactly what legals are included in that spacing your pooling order. And that'll determine what units you would have an interest in and how much of it would be part of that unit. Another important thing that you're going to want to learn is the depth and what formations this well goes through and what their plans are. The objective formation in this case is the Niobrara. So they're actually going into the Niobrara formation, and that's the primary formation they're going to be producing from. So that's helpful to know because in the DJ Basin, they can produce from both the Niobrara and the Codell. Okay, looking at the well plat here, and this is laid out horizontally, but you have to kind of think about it vertically because that's how these are stacked if you look north to south. But again, it shows the path of this wellbore starting, in this case, the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter, and then going due north all the way up to the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter of section 4. And it's on the east side of these sections. But again, because the pooling order said that all of section 4, all of section 9, and the north half of section 16 are included or pooled together, then even though our interests in this hypothetical example are located in the southwest quarter, which that doesn't contain that wellbore, we're actually going to receive royalties from this well. So that's why it's so important to look at those pooling orders in states that have statutory pooling, because that'll tell you what areas are going to be part of those drilling and spacing units. Now, within Colorado especially, it's pretty easy to figure out what the status of these wells are. If it is something where they're drilling that little blue star that I mentioned earlier, you see that. What stage are they in? Are they drilling the horizontal section or the surface location? Sometimes they'll come in and just bring a vertical rig in and drill and set the surface casing, and then they'll come back later with the horizontal rig and then drill the rest of the wellbore. But they have to give notice when they plan on spudding the well, which is when they plan on starting the drill. And this tells me that they plan to start February 28th of 2023. So we can tell that from this sundry notice, field operations notice. And then they had one when the well was spud. In this case, the surface hole only was the Patterson 268 rig that came in. And they actually spudded on March 4th. So that's good to know. And then they must have finished that well out in between then and April, because they gave notice that they would hydraulically frack or complete the well on May 3rd, 2023. And this was a 4-well zipper frack, and they basically complete multiple wells at the same time. It's just a term that's used. And the duration for completing all those 4 wells was 20 days. So that gives you an idea. That well would have come online in sometime in the month of May. And then there's other diagrams like the wellbore diagram, which you can look at, that shows what the casing and tubing strings look like, how the depth that it goes down, where the perforations go along the lateral. So information that you can get here publicly available on the State Oil and Gas Commission, in this case, the COGCC website. Justin, what other questions come to mind, or what other issues do you see that you would want to find out about this well?
One of the other things is looking at different wells on the site and looking at those dates for overriding royalty interest purposes. That's something that you want to see continuous production. That's a kind of the first clue that that lease did not lapse, and then go from there.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's say in this case, in section 4, it looks like there were other well bores, some other vertical wells that were plugged and abandoned. The reason I can tell that is because of the symbol. The red dot in the middle is the well location, and then sort of like a cross here tells me that that well was plugged and abandoned. And so I'd want to look and see, to your point, Justin, let's say these wells had been producing. Did these continue to produce up until the point where they started producing from these new wells, or were they plugged before? And we'll have to go look at the dates with these wells that were plugged and abandoned. And they have it here. If you hover over the icon, you can see the status. It says PA 8/22/2016. So that well was plugged and abandoned in August of 2016. Same thing with this one. It was plugged in 2016. This was plugged in 2020, plugged in 2015, plugged in 2021, which is the latest one. So that tells me that there potentially would have been a gap in between when the previous lease had been active into where these new wells were drilled. Now, the only thing would be we'd have to go and look at all of these 7. What sometimes happens is an operator could come in and drill one well to hold the lease, and then they'll come back later and then drill the rest of those wells. And so the way we'd have to figure that out is we'd have to look at all 7 of those wells within this particular drilling and spacing unit, figure out when they were drilled, and see, was one of those actually drilled in 2021, which is kind of what I would be hoping if I had an overriding royalty interest. So this other one looks like they're both 2023 so far. 2023, another one, 2023. Completed in 2023, producing in 2023. So far, everything was just drilled in 2023, Justin. So I think if we had an overriding royalty in this particular one, we might have been out of luck. The only thing would be this particular well here, and this is another thing to look for within any state, is if you have a lease line well, and this well in particular looks like it goes right in between 2 North, 64 West, Section 3 and Section 4. So it might be one of these wells that you'd have to click on to see, is there a different spacing unit? And this one is really interesting. This one was drilled and started producing, looks like in 2014, and we can confirm that by looking at the production data and see when the well started producing, and going all the way down to the bottom. Looks like the date of first production was July 1st, 2014. So it looks like this is a wellbore spacing unit that includes different tracks, and it includes the east half of Section 4. So if we had an overriding royalty interest in the east half of Section 4, which is this area here, it looks like there was one well that was plugged in 2016. So, and sure enough, let's say we had an overriding royalty interest, at least the east half of the east half would have been held by production by that one lease line well, the Oscar Y1079HN, which was drilled in 2014, because this well wasn't plugged until 2016. So that tells us that there was continuous production from when we saw that well drilled to when these Gig'em State wells were drilled, and from this Oscar well that has been holding that lease in the meantime. So that's the type of information you can find on these State Oil and Gas Commission websites. That's the steps you would need to go through. And again, it's a little bit of investigative work, and you have to figure out the timing of these things to figure out if your lease would have still been active if you have an override. Now, with mineral rights, you don't have to worry about that. That usually is perpetual, depending on your state and dormant mineral statutes there. But generally speaking, that runs with the land. It goes in perpetuity. So as long as you had an interest in those minerals, even if the lease expired, then you would have an opportunity to sign a new lease and then receive royalties from the new wells that are drilled. So that is an overview of how to navigate the ECMC map. Like I mentioned, if you wanted to hone in on this a different way, again, if you were just looking for the map itself, if you started out from the beginning, you can search a couple of different ways. Generally speaking, because Colorado follows the PLSS or the rectangular survey system, it's very easy just to sort of hone in visually. And that's usually what I end up doing. If you knew it was in Weld County, which is up here, you just kind of zoom in until you see the legal description of the townships. And down here, you can see 1 north, 62 west. And it's like an XY coordinate for 2 north, 64 west. I need to go 2 townships west and 1 township north. So that tells me that I'm looking right around here, and I would just zoom in until I found 2 north, 64 west, and in section 4. And then I can, click on the wells and then navigate that way. So that's within Colorado because it follows the PLSS. Very easy just to navigate visually. You can also search by latitude and longitude. You can search by the legal description, but generally speaking, it's probably just easier to visually zoom in with your mouse and scroll around and use that little hand icon to find things. And again, if you want to click on a well to find out more, you have to click on the arrow icon, and then you can double click on it and it'll pull up the well scout card. All right, well, that wraps up how to navigate the Colorado ECMC website. If you're listening to this episode, you can check out the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com, where you'll find a link to the accompanying video, which I'd highly recommend watching because, again, sometimes a picture is 1,000 words. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe. See the link below for other similar videos that we've done in other states, or you can check the description for the link to the ECMC website and to the show notes on mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you in the next video.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.